Teaching poetry doesn't require you to be a poetry person. By the end of this episode, you'll have a way in that works for any poem, and you already know how to do it. I want to start out by sharing a poem with you. It's called Introduction to Poetry, and it's by Billy Collins, who was the US Poet Laureate in the early 2000s, and is probably the poet I come back to the most when I'm thinking about how to teach poetry.
I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch.
Get a printout of the poem, even if you're, a one-to-one device in your school, even if you're a proud paperless classroom teacher. I'm telling you, give your students the poem on a sheet of paper, right? Just print it out, do it. Have your students go through and circle the periods. What are some other end punctuations for poems? Question marks, exclamation marks. So have your students go through and circle those ending punctuation marks, the beginning and end of a sentence, and then start talking about that. Okay, how many sentences are in the poem? How many lines are in the poem? And they're going to get two different numbers. It's not the same thing. That right there is huge for comprehension. And so when you have your students do that every single time with every single poem, even if they haven't read it yet, you could give your students a poem cold and teach them that the first thing to do is go through and circle the periods, the question marks, the exclamation points, just to get it in their minds that sentences and lines are not the same thing.
I think that the biggest struggle is with the syntax that we see in poems. Like the way the words are ordered is so much different in any kind of poem that you're looking at. It's going to be so different than how we talk. And I think that that is the biggest struggle, that it's not how we read a normal text. It's not how we talk. Like it's just this completely different animal that nobody understands. And so if we focus on where are the complete thoughts, where are the periods, that's whenever we can figure it out.
If you read the Raven and you read it once, but then if you read it again and you read it for infinitives, and then you read it for participles, and then you read it for gerunds, well, then you've read it 4 times. And so it's just a different way of looking at poetry, kind of taking a grammatical lens. And so I've experimented with poetry that way and had a lot of success.
So here's what I noticed across everything these teachers said. None of them solved the poetry problem by becoming poetry experts. And what they found wasn't a deeper knowledge of the poem necessarily. It was a way in that didn't require them to have all the answers first. What Laura is doing with lines versus sentences, and what Allison is doing with syntax, and what Laura Lee is doing when she reads the same poem 4 times through those different grammatical lenses, none of that requires you to know what the poem means, like in a right and wrong answer sense. It just requires you to know how language works. And you already know that. So that's the move. You take the things that feel foreign, like the stanza, the line break, the weird syntax, and you run it through something you already understand: grammar, punctuation, sentences. And suddenly the poem isn't an impossible object anymore. It's just a text that's organized differently than the ones you're used to.
I'll take a poem that I want to teach. And these days now, I used to do this by hand before, but now you could copy and paste the poem into an AI tool of your choice and have the AI tool rewrite the poem in a paragraph format. And, be careful with your prompt. Be sure to tell, don't change the meaning. Do not move any of the information around. Don't reorganize. I just want you to take this poem and put it into a paragraph format. Give that paragraph, give that to your students and tell them this is actually a poem, but it looks like a paragraph. So if you were going to restructure this paragraph in the structure and the design of a poem, how would you do that? How would you break it up? And you'll have kids start asking you, well, is it like, how many stanzas does it need to be? I'm not telling you.
The grammar lens is a light switch. It doesn't tell you what the poem means. It just lets you see inside the room.
I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch.
The second thing I kept hearing is something I think we all know, but maybe don't say out loud. The biggest obstacle isn't the poem. It's actually the word poetry itself. The moment our students see that label, they're done, right? So these teachers figured out ways to get students into poetic language without ever triggering that shutdown. But they all kept saying the same thing. the experience has to come first.
I really like to use novels in verse. That has been a really great way to get kids to connect. So it's more of a storyline rather than just like this one poem where I know they feel intimidated. Like, it seems confusing and they're not sure. But when you're teaching it along with plot structure, it becomes a lot more approachable.
I heard on a Facebook group about doing a March Madness tournament, and suddenly I felt like building a poetry unit around March Madness clicked, and it was like relatable and fun, even if it was with poetry. And then one of the poems that I brought in for that was a poem by Tupac, which was A Rose That Grew from Concrete. And I'm a 90s kid, so Tupac was everything. Sorry to all the Biggie fans. But when I found out that my favorite rapper had written a poem, something shifted and I thought, okay, if Tupac wrote this, I can figure out what it means. I can work with this. And that was the moment that I also realized how important it is to find poets or poems that relate to your students. And you've won half the battle because I experienced that as a reader myself.
I just send out a simple Google form and say, hey, I'd love to hear your suggestions. Give me some, and I give them parameters, some clean ideas, just, maybe one or two cuss words. If I can black them out, then, I'll consider it. And some send me completely inappropriate and I just discard them. But I do get some really good suggestions. And, it increases student buy-in. It takes me a little bit of time, but it doesn't take me as much time as you'd think.
We do escape rooms, and really it could be done at the beginning of the unit or at the end. But the escape rooms, I include little videos in there so that they can review if they need to. And in order for them to move from one room to the other, they have to understand, like, for example, the similes, metaphors, and personification. Or they'll have to read a poem and identify the theme, and then enter the code, of course. But they look at it as a game. And if they finish first, which normally I don't encourage, but for this I do because I know they have to go back and get the right answer to even move forward.
Right.
So they want to finish first so they get whatever the reward is. So anytime you can gamify it, it kind of changes everything in a good way.
I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore.
And then there's this thing underneath all of it that I think is the one we most need to hear. Almost every one of these teachers talked about slowing down, about letting students just be in a poem before asking them to do anything with it. And I know how hard that is. We have standards, we have pacing, we have maybe 42 minutes.
I'm in favor of the strategy of asking students to experience the poem first, just letting them be in the poem. So maybe we're playing a spoken word performance or listening to a song or just reading a poem and asking, what did that make you think? What did that make you feel? Before we ever even mention a single literary term, like connotation or whatever. We have to invite them to sit with the physical sensory experience of the poem because we're looking for those keywords like, I felt that, or that sounded cool, or wait, that's a poem? We need those reactions from students before we can ask them to analyze. That way, when we do ask them to analyze, it's less of an intimidation or an obligation. So in that sense, experience before label, right? I'm looking for students to experience it before I ever put a label to it. We don't have all the answers. There isn't always a right or a wrong answer. And reviewing the answer key just means you're familiar enough with the poem to be a confident guide for students. That's it. It doesn't mean that there's only one way to read the poem or experience it, but it does give you the ability to let your students in on the experience instead of just throwing them into the deep end.
I started creating them poetry autopsies. Kids really seem to gravitate towards that because it's very directed and it's kind of showing them step by step how they can dissect it while still enjoying it as a whole. I do think that they need to know the poetic devices before they start. And I do think they are something that you have to teach on repeat and spiral around them, but also teach little by little because it can be very complicated depending on what poem you're reading or what you want them to write. I think it makes it feel like a little mystery to them, and it's something that they have to solve. And I know for a middle school student, anytime you can make it feel kind of like a game, that's what makes it work for them. Letting letting them know that the ultimate report of the poem is nothing that has to be what I thought it should be. It's what they think it should be. So I think that keeping it, it's like you're keeping it structured, but you're also keeping it very open-ended to interpretation at the same time.
So I have found a framework, a method for analysis that I use for any poem that I read with my students, and that really helps. I know the framework really well, and so that helps me to not only teach it, but also understand it myself. So I use the TPCast method for understanding and analyzing poetry, and that has really helped me as a reader and also as a teacher too. So if we focus on where are the complete thoughts, where are the periods, that's whenever we can figure it out. And that's what I would tell my younger self, don't stress out, just, figure out where are the subject and the verbs and go from there.
But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.
Okay, so when I sat back and looked at everything that all of these teachers said, I was a little bit surprised because I went in this thinking that I would be giving you these 12 strategies that veteran teachers came up with, and I did, right? You've got those. But what I came to is that these aren't really poetry strategies. The grammar move is an access move. You're saying to your students, you already know how to do this. Look, it's just sentences. The Tupac and the songs and the escape room, those are investment moves. You're saying, this is already yours. You already live in this language. And the experience before analysis, the autopsy, the answer key reframe, those are trust moves. You're saying you belong in this poem before anyone asks you to get a right answer or to try to break it down or to do anything else with it. So it's access, investment, and trust. And if that sounds familiar, I think it should, because that's what you do every time you launch a novel, every time you set up a discussion, every time you go to the classroom at the beginning of the year. You already do this. You just maybe haven't done it with poetry yet. So here's what I keep coming back to. Every one of these teachers figured out the same thing. If we look at it, if we take a step back and look at the pattern, the problem isn't the poem, it's what we're asking students to do before they're ready. We skip the experience and we hand them something and say, analyze this before they've had a chance to just read it like a sentence, like a human. And look, I do this too. I've absolutely done this. Given kids a poem and wondered why they look at me like I've handed them something in a different language. Every strategy you just heard is a different way of just slowing that down and letting students orient themselves before we ask them to do some kind of performance. Which, if you think about it, it's kind of what a poem asks us to do, right? It looks simple, it's short, maybe. We think we should be able to get it right away, but the whole point is we have to sit with it and read it more than once. And the meaning isn't hiding, we're just not there yet. And I think that's the part nobody tells us, nobody in our training, in our PD, or anywhere really, that it's okay to not get there on the first read. It's not failure. That's just how poems work for our students and for us. Okay, so that's it. I hope that these strategies helped you and you're able to take them into your classroom. I also want to share in the description, there are some freebies that you can check out from the teachers that shared today. Thanks for hanging out.